So what about heart disease? Well, the evidence for heart disease, we had a couple of early studies, and in these studies, basically showing that keto diets increase total LDL and HDL cholesterol, but they decrease triglycerides. The 2006 study also reported improved particle size. We have 3 meta-analyses looking at low carb versus low fat, and when I say low fat, it's almost always just under 30%, so it's not really low fat, but it's you know what they label low fat. So in 2012, 23 studies, in 2013, 32 studies, in 2016, 11 studies, and the findings were very consistent that low-fat diets lower total and LDL cholesterol, and high-fat diets lower triglycerides and increase HDL and increase total and LDL cholesterol. And in children with epilepsy, the findings are very interesting. Several studies between 2015 and 2017 finding that keto diets consistently promoted negative changes in lipid profile and particle size, increasing, they're just atherogenic diets. And so what they reported was increased total and LDL cholesterol, increased triglycerides, increased oxidative stress, unfavorable changes in particle size, so all negative findings. And then if we look at cardiovascular disease and low carbohydrate diets in general, the findings are so consistent. When we have a low carbohydrate diet that's mainly animal food diet, and this study in 2010, it increased mortality 14%. If the protein came from plants, it actually reduced mortality 23%. And then this study in 2012, the lowest carbohydrate eaters had a 60% increase in mortality. So that's huge. They actually quantified the increase. For every 20 grams of carbohydrate you eliminate from your diet, and for every 5 grams of protein you add to your diet, you increase risk of cardiovascular disease by 5%. That's incredible. And then in 2014, this study showed, this is a US study, and they showed that a low-carb, high animal protein diet increased risk by 51%, and that's mortality risk. The low-carbohydrate plant diet, there was no association with increased mortality. So the last is longevity, and the evidence in favor of longevity is just 2017 studies that reported increased midlife longevity using ketogenic diets in mice. It improved their memory and health span, their strength and speed, and all of that. And so we have no human studies. So when they say that it helps with longevity, the studies are very limited and they're not based on humans. But we do have some strong studies on longevity and low carbohydrate diets in people. And these aren't randomized control trials, but these are studies that we've been following people for a long time. People eating the low-carb animal diets, it increased mortality 23%, and with low-carb plant, it reduced mortality 20%. And in 2014, low-carb animal diet increased mortality 33%. And then the newest study, the 2018 study, the lowest carbohydrate intake was associated with a 32% increase in mortality risk. The last ones I was talking about were cardiovascular disease mortality, and I don't know if I made that clear. So this is total overall mortality. This study was really interesting because, again, if you look at it, this is a graph showing the link between carbohydrate intake and mortality. And you can see the highest mortality is consistently with the lowest carbohydrate intake. And then you see the lowest mortality at around 50 to 55% of carbohydrates. And then you see mortality going up again. And so you think, what is with that? Because this is, diets that are fairly low-fat, plant-based diets, they're like 75 or 80% carbohydrate because they're about 10% protein and about 10% fat, right? So why are we seeing this? Well, actually, the low carbohydrate intake, what we saw was a 32% increased mortality with high carbohydrate intake, we saw a 23% increased mortality. So not as much as the low carbohydrate diet. The lowest risk, as I mentioned, 50 to 55%. And this part here, mortality increased 18% when the carbohydrate was exchanged for animal-derived fat or protein, and it decreased by 18% when the substitutions were plant-based. But here's why they think the association with the high carbohydrate intake was. It's because high carbohydrate diets in these studies were associated with refined carbohydrates. So the populations were mainly people eating white flour and white rice. And they thought they wouldn't have seen that increase if the carbohydrates were actually coming from whole foods. So the authors concluded these data provide further evidence that animal-based low-carbohydrate diets, which are more prevalent in North American and European populations, should be discouraged. So then we have to say, how much carbohydrates do the world's healthiest people eat? The people who live the longest lives, like the people of the blue zones, who live to be 100 and are still productive, what do they eat to be able to achieve that kind of longevity? Well, actually, their carbohydrate intakes, sorry, I shouldn't have switched that so fast, their carbohydrate intakes, you can see range from about 40% to over 80%, but they average about 62%. Can you see the difference here? Here's the longest, healthiest people on the planet. Here's what their diet looks like. About 25% fat, about 12% protein, and about 62% carbohydrate. This looks very different than ketogenic or paleo diets, right? Or at least what people call paleo diets. So if we look at the Tsimane in Bolivia and South America, these are the people that live a sort of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They have the lowest reported rates of chronic disease of any population on the planet. What is their diet? It's 14% protein, 14% fat, and 72% carbohydrate. So the verdict is, I think, can be summed up fairly well with this quote from Michael Pollan: eat food, mostly plants, not too much. That's the key to longevity. So in summary, keto benefits are reduction in epileptic seizures, decreased energy intakes, weight loss, improved blood sugar, decreased triglycerides, increased HDL. The risks short-term: increased LDL cholesterol, impaired glucose tolerance, worsening kidney function, reduced athletic performance, bone loss, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, constipation, weakness, fatigue, bad breath, and muscle cramps, and headaches. And in the short term, in the long term, increased all-cause mortality, increased exposure to persistent organic pollutants that induce metabolic disorders and increase birth defects. Persistent organic pollutants are things like dioxins and PCBs because they move up the food chain. Impaired artery function, increased total and LDL cholesterol, kidney stones, nutritional deficiencies, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and hepatic steatosis, which is worse than non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.